The year 1945 stands as perhaps the most transformative moment in Soviet history. A year when victory and devastation existed side by side, when triumph over Nazi Germany revealed both the immense power and the profound wounds of the Soviet state. To understand what the Soviet Union looked like in this pivotal year is to witness a nation at the absolute peak of its military achievement, while simultaneously confronting losses so catastrophic they would shape Soviet society for generations to come. This was not simply the year the war ended. This was the year that forged the superpower that would dominate half the globe for the next 4 decades. And the scars of that forging ran deeper than most Western observers ever understood. When February arrived, the Soviet Union had already driven German forces back across Eastern Europe, but the war was far from over. The Red Army was closing in on Berlin, pushing through Poland and East Prussia in one of the most brutal campaigns of the entire conflict. It was in this context that Joseph Stalin traveled to the Crimean resort town of Yalta, a location chosen partly because Stalin refused to fly and partly because Soviet territory offered him maximum control over the proceedings. The Yalta Conference, which convened from February 4th through February 11th, brought together the leaders of the 3 major Allied powers. Stalin arrived with a position of unprecedented strength. His armies occupied Poland, Romania, Bulgaria, and much of Hungary. He controlled facts on the ground that no amount of diplomatic maneuvering could reverse. Across the table sat Franklin Delano Roosevelt, visibly weakened by illness and with only 2 months left to live, and Winston Churchill, whose political power was already beginning to wane. The agreements reached at Yalta would be debated and condemned for decades afterward, accused of selling out Eastern Europe to Soviet domination, but the reality was more complex. Stalin demanded and received recognition of Soviet security interests in Eastern Europe, a sphere of influence that he argued was necessary to prevent another invasion from the West. Germany had invaded Russia twice in 30 years, and Stalin was determined it would never happen again. The borders of Poland were redrawn, shifting the entire country westward. The eastern territories, which the Soviet Union had seized in 1939 under the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact, would remain Soviet. Poland would be compensated with German territory in the west. Germany itself would be divided into occupation zones, with the Soviet Union controlling the eastern portion. The foundations of the United Nations were established, with Stalin insisting on veto power for permanent Security Council members, a provision that would define international relations for the rest of the century. But while Stalin negotiated the future of Europe in the relative comfort of the Levadia Palace, Soviet soldiers were dying by the thousands in the frozen marshes and shattered cities of Eastern Europe. The final push into Germany was among the bloodiest phases of the entire war. The Battle of Berlin alone, which would begin in April, cost the Red Army over 80,000 dead and nearly 300,000 wounded in just 2 weeks of fighting. These were not the desperate defensive battles of 1941 and 1942. These were offensive operations conducted by a military machine that had learned through unimaginable sacrifice how to destroy the Wehrmacht. The Red Army of 1945 bore little resemblance to the force that had nearly collapsed under the initial German onslaught. It had become a mechanized juggernaut, equipped with thousands of T-34 tanks, supported by massive artillery concentrations, and led by commanders who had survived the purges and the early disasters to become genuinely skilled practitioners of operational warfare. What made the Soviet war effort unique, and what would define Soviet society for decades afterward, was the total mobilization of the population. This was not a war fought by professional soldiers while civilians maintained the home front. This was a war in which the distinction between soldier and civilian had effectively ceased to exist. Women served in combat roles on a scale unprecedented in modern warfare. Over 800,000 women served in the Soviet military, and they were not confined to support roles. Women flew combat missions as fighter and bomber pilots. The all-female 588th Night Bomber Regiment, known to the Germans as the Night Witches, flew over 23,000 sorties, with 23 of its members receiving the Hero of the Soviet Union award. Women served as snipers, with Lyudmila Pavlichenko credited with 309 confirmed kills. Women operated anti-aircraft batteries, drove tanks, and fought as partisans behind German lines. This mass participation of women in combat was partly born of desperate necessity, but it also reflected Soviet ideology about gender equality, an ideology that existed in tension with deeply traditional attitudes about women's roles in society. The photographs and newsreels from the front lines in early 1945 show soldiers who had learned to find moments of humanity amid the horror. Between assaults, Red Army units organized concerts and dances. Accordions and balalaikas appeared from somewhere, and soldiers danced and sang, often traditional folk songs from their home regions. These moments of normalcy were psychologically essential. The Red Army had suffered casualties that would have broken any other military force. By the time the war ended, Soviet military deaths would exceed 8.5 million, with total Soviet deaths, including civilians, reaching approximately 27 million. Every soldier had seen friends die, often in ways that defied comprehension. The psychological toll of this, sustained trauma would affect Soviet society long after the victory parades ended. The word that defined 1945 was victory, and when it finally came, the entire nation erupted in celebration. The German surrender was signed twice, first in Reims on May 7th, and then in Berlin on May 8th, with the Soviet Union insisting on a separate ceremony in the captured German capital. In Moscow, it was Yuri Levitan who announced the news. Levitan was not a political figure or a military commander. He was a radio announcer, but his voice had become synonymous with Soviet resistance. He had announced every major communique throughout the war, and his distinctive baritone had become a source of stability and authority. When he read the victory announcement on the morning of May 9th, his voice carried across the entire Soviet Union, reaching cities, villages, collective farms, and military units. The story that he barely made it to the radio station because of the crowds was likely apocryphal, but it captured a deeper truth about the moment. The entire nation had been waiting for this announcement, and when it came, the reaction was spontaneous and overwhelming. The official victory salute in Moscow took place on the evening of May 9th, 1945. 1,000 guns fired 30 salvos, and the night sky over the capital was illuminated by searchlights and fireworks. Crowds filled Red Square and the surrounding streets, celebrating with an intensity born of 4 years of sacrifice and suffering. But the celebrations were tinged with profound grief. There was hardly a family in the Soviet Union that had not lost someone. Entire villages had been destroyed. Cities like Stalingrad, Leningrad, and Minsk were in ruins. The western regions of the Soviet Union, which had been under German occupation, had been systematically devastated. The Nazis had implemented a policy of deliberate extermination, targeting Jews, communists, and anyone suspected of resistance. The scale of destruction was almost incomprehensible. 1,700 towns and 70,000 villages had been destroyed. 32,000 factories had been damaged or demolished. The collective farms that had been the foundation of Soviet agriculture were shattered. As spring turned to summer, soldiers began returning home. The demobilization was a massive logistical undertaking. Millions of men needed to be transported from Central Europe back to the Soviet Union, and then dispersed to their home regions. Trains marked with slogans proclaiming they had come from Berlin pulled into stations across the country. The most iconic scenes played out at Moscow's Belaruski railway station, where crowds, predominantly women, gathered with flowers to greet the returning soldiers. The photograph that became known as Flowers to the Winner captured this moment perfectly. A young woman, her face radiant with joy and relief, presents a bouquet to a soldier descending from the train. The image became one of the defining photographs of the Soviet 20th century, reproduced endlessly in textbooks, museums, and propaganda materials. It represented the narrative the Soviet state wanted to tell about the war. A story of heroic sacrifice rewarded by grateful citizens, of national unity and shared purpose. But the reality was more complicated. Many soldiers returned to find their homes destroyed, their families scattered or dead. Others returned with physical and psychological wounds that would never fully heal. The Soviet state had little capacity or inclination to provide what would later be called post-traumatic stress support. Veterans were expected to reintegrate into civilian life quickly and without complaint. Those who struggled were often viewed with suspicion. Soldiers who had been captured by the Germans were treated particularly harshly. Stalin viewed capture as a form of treason, and returning prisoners of war were often sent directly to the Gulag. Even soldiers who had fought bravely and been liberated by advancing Soviet forces found themselves interrogated and accused of collaboration. This paranoia reflected Stalin's deep distrust of anyone who had been exposed to the outside world, even under the most horrific circumstances. The Victory Parade held on June 24, 1945, was designed to showcase Soviet military power to both domestic and international audiences. The parade had been delayed from May to allow time for preparation and to ensure that enough troops could be brought back to Moscow. Marshal Georgy Zhukov, who had commanded the final assault on Berlin, was given the honor of inspecting the troops. He rode a white horse, a deliberate echo of Imperial Russian military tradition, while Stalin watched from atop the Lenin Mausoleum. The symbolism was carefully constructed. Zhukov, the greatest Soviet military commander, acknowledged Stalin's supreme authority even in the moment of triumph. The parade itself was a demonstration of Soviet military might. Columns of infantry marched in perfect formation, followed by tanks, artillery, and mobile anti-aircraft batteries. Representatives of Allied forces were present, but they were spectators, not participants. This was a Soviet victory, and Stalin wanted no ambiguity about that fact. The most dramatic moment came when 200 captured German standards and banners were brought forward and thrown down at the base of the mausoleum. This was a deliberate recreation of a similar ceremony that had taken place in Moscow in 1814, when Russian troops had defeated Napoleon. The message was clear. The Soviet Union stood in the tradition of Russian military greatness, and Stalin was the heir to that tradition. The soldiers who carried the Nazi banners wore special gloves, which they discarded along with the banners, symbolically refusing to be contaminated by contact with fascist symbols. After the parade, Moscow was illuminated by a massive light show, with searchlights crisscrossing the sky and fireworks exploding over the Kremlin. Concerts were held in squares and parks throughout the city, and the celebrations continued late into the night. But even as Moscow celebrated, the reality of Soviet victory was starkly visible in places like Stalingrad. On the same day as the Moscow parade, a pioneer parade was held in the ruins of what had once been a major industrial city. Stalingrad had been almost completely destroyed during the battle that bore its name, a 5-month struggle from August 1942 to February 1943 that had cost both sides hundreds of thousands of casualties. By June 1945, much of the city was still rubble. Children marched in formation through streets lined with shattered buildings, past the burned-out hulks of tanks and the skeletal remains of factories. The juxtaposition was deliberate. The Soviet state wanted to show that even in the midst of devastation, Soviet society was returning to normal, that children were being educated and organized, that the future was being built. This return to normalcy was a central theme of Soviet life in the second half of 1945. With the war in Europe over, the Soviet Union began the massive task of reconstruction. Factories that had been evacuated to the Urals and Siberia in 1941 began returning to their original locations. Collective farms attempted to resume production despite shortages of equipment, draft animals, and able-bodied workers. Cities started clearing rubble and rebuilding essential infrastructure. But this was not a market-driven reconstruction. Every aspect was planned and directed by the state, with priorities determined by the needs of military security and industrial production rather than consumer welfare or individual comfort. The summer of 1945 saw the resumption of pre-war rituals and traditions, adapted to the new circumstances. Pioneer girls played with hoops in parks and schoolyards, a simple activity that symbolized the return of childhood innocence after years when children had been forced to grow up far too quickly. Soccer matches resumed, and the sport's popularity, which had been growing throughout the 1930s, exploded in the post-war period. Soccer offered an outlet for emotions and energies that had been channeled into survival and combat for 4 years. Traffic jams appeared in Moscow as people traveled to matches, a sign that civilian life, with its mundane inconveniences, was returning. In August, the traditional parade of athletes was held on Red Square, a massive demonstration of physical culture that had been a staple of Soviet life before the war. Thousands of young people, members of voluntary sports societies like Krylia Sovetov, marched in precise formations, performing synchronized gymnastics and creating elaborate human pyramids and patterns. These displays were not simply entertainment. They were demonstrations of Soviet organizational capacity and of the health and vigor of Soviet youth. The subtext was clear. Despite 4 years of devastating war, the Soviet Union could still mobilize thousands of young people for displays of collective discipline and physical prowess. The parades were also implicitly militaristic. The formations and movements echoed military drills, and many of the sports societies had direct connections to military or security organizations. September 1st, 1945, marked the first Knowledge Day celebrated after the war's end. Schools reopened and students returned to classrooms, many wearing military medals alongside their school uniforms. Some of these students had fought as partisans or served in support roles. Others had worked in factories or on collective farms, doing adult labor while barely into their teens. The resumption of formal education was another step toward normalcy, but it was normalcy transformed by the war experience. The curriculum emphasized patriotism, military preparedness, and the heroic narrative of Soviet victory. Students learned about the great battles, the heroic commanders, and the wisdom of Stalin's leadership. What they did not learn about were the mistakes, the unnecessary casualties, the political purges that had weakened the military before the war, or the brutal realities of occupation and collaboration. Throughout 1945, even as the Soviet Union celebrated victory in Europe, it was preparing for continued conflict in Asia. The Soviet Union had remained neutral in the war between Japan and the Western Allies, bound by a non-aggression pact signed in 1941. But at Yalta, Stalin had secretly agreed to enter the war against Japan within 3 months of Germany's defeat, in exchange for territorial concessions in the Far East. On August 8, 1945, exactly 3 months after the German surrender, the Soviet Union declared war on Japan and launched a massive invasion of Japanese-occupied Manchuria. The operation involved over 1.5 million Soviet troops and demonstrated that the Red Army had lost none of its offensive capability. Within weeks, Japanese forces in Manchuria had been effectively destroyed, and the Soviet Union occupied northern Korea, the Kuril Islands, and southern Sakhalin. The atomic bombings of Hiroshima and Nagasaki, combined with the Soviet invasion, forced Japan's surrender on August 15th, bringing World War II to a final conclusion. The Soviet intervention in Asia was brief but consequential. It established Soviet presence in Northeast Asia that would shape the region's politics for decades. The division of Korea at the 38th parallel, initially intended as a temporary administrative measure, would harden into a permanent partition and eventually lead to the Korean War. The territorial gains in the Far East, modest compared to Soviet gains in Europe, were nevertheless significant for Soviet strategic interests and national pride, rectifying what was seen as the humiliation of the Russo-Japanese War of 1904 to 1905. By the end of 1945, the Soviet Union had emerged as one of the two dominant powers in the world, but the cost had been almost unimaginable. The 27 million Soviet deaths represented roughly 14% of the pre-war population. Some regions lost a quarter or more of their inhabitants. The demographic impact would be felt for generations, with a severe gender imbalance and a missing generation that created labor shortages and social disruptions. The psychological impact was equally profound. An entire society had been traumatized, and that trauma would be passed down through families and communities. The Soviet state's response was to emphasize collective strength and to suppress individual expressions of grief or doubt. The narrative of the Great Patriotic War, as it came to be called, was one of heroic sacrifice and inevitable victory, guided by the genius of Stalin and the superiority of the Soviet system. This narrative served important political purposes. It legitimized Stalin's continued rule, despite the catastrophic losses of the early war years. It justified the enormous sacrifices the Soviet people had made, and would continue to make during Reconstruction. It provided a foundation for Soviet claims to leadership in Eastern Europe and influence in global affairs, and it created a powerful myth of national unity and purpose that could be invoked whenever the state needed to mobilize the population for new sacrifices and new struggles. The Cold War, which was already beginning to take shape in 1945 as the wartime alliance fractured, would be fought partly through competing narratives about World War II and its meaning. Looking back across 8 decades, 1945 stands as the pivotal year that created the world we still inhabit in many ways. The division of Europe, the emergence of the nuclear age, the beginning of decolonization, and the establishment of the United Nations all trace their origins to decisions made in that year. For the Soviet Union, 1945 represented both the peak of achievement and the beginning of a long decline. The victory over Nazi Germany was real and hard-won, purchased with suffering that defies comprehension. The Soviet people had every right to celebrate their survival and their triumph. But the political system that claimed credit for that victory was the same system that had left the country vulnerable to invasion through purges and strategic miscalculations, that had treated its own citizens with suspicion and cruelty, and that would continue to demand sacrifices long after the war ended. The images of soldiers returning home, of children playing in parks, of parades and celebrations were real, but they coexisted with mass graves, ruined cities, broken families, and a political system that valued power above human life. The Soviet Union that emerged from World War II was a superpower, but it was a superpower built on foundations that would eventually prove unsustainable. And the contradictions visible in 1945 would, over the next 4 decades, slowly tear it apart.